For 50 years, everyone thought Purple Haze was about drugs. Radio stations banned it, parents burned the record, but Jimi Hendrix said they were all wrong. The real inspiration? A science fiction story about the end of the world. It was December 1966, and Jimi Hendrix was crammed in the back of a tour van somewhere between London and the next gig. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had been touring constantly since forming just a few months earlier. Jimi was exhausted, uncomfortable, and bored out of his mind during the long drives across England. To pass the time, Jimi had been reading. He'd always loved science fiction. The weirder and more psychedelic, the better. His girlfriend at the time had given him a collection of short stories by Philip K. Dick, and Jimi had been devouring them between shows. One story in particular had captured his imagination. It was called The Night of Light, and it was about a planet called Dante's Joy, where once every 7 years something strange happened. A night of light would occur, a period when the planet's sun turned purple and reality itself broke down. People's thoughts became real. Nightmares manifested. The boundary between imagination and reality disappeared. The story described people going mad during this purple time, unable to distinguish between what was real and what their minds created. Some people survived by building special rooms where they could hide until the purple night passed. Others went insane and never recovered.
Jimi was fascinated by this concept, the idea that reality could become fluid, that the mind could reshape the world, that perception itself could become unreliable. It resonated with something he'd been feeling in his own life: the sudden fame, the constant touring, the blur between his stage persona and his real self. It all felt like reality breaking down. In the back of that tour van, Jimi pulled out a notebook and started scribbling lyrics. The opening line came to him almost immediately: "Purple haze all in my brain." It wasn't about drugs, though the connection seemed obvious. It was about that purple sun from the Philip K. Dick story, about reality becoming unstable, about not being sure what was real anymore. Lately things, they don't seem the same. That was Jimi's life on tour. Acting funny, but I don't know why. That was the disorientation of fame, of being Jimi Hendrix the performer when he was still Jimi from Seattle inside. "Excuse me while I kiss the sky" wasn't about getting high. It was about reaching for something transcendent, about trying to escape the confusion of earthly reality. In the Philip K. Dick story, people looked up at that purple sky with a mixture of fear and awe. Jimi captured that feeling in one line. Within 20 minutes, he'd written most of the song. The music came even faster. That iconic opening riff, the dissonant chords, the way the song felt slightly off balance, like reality tilting. It all flowed out of him in a creative burst inspired by science fiction, not drugs. When the Experience got to their next gig, Jimi showed the song to Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. They rehearsed it a few times and performed it that night. The audience went wild. There was something about the song that grabbed people immediately: the mysterious lyrics, the hypnotic riff, the sense that you were hearing something important even if you didn't fully understand it.
They recorded Purple Haze at Delane Lee Studios in London on January 11, 1967. The recording session was legendary. Jimi used a new effect he'd been experimenting with, an Octavia pedal that doubled his guitar signal an octave higher, creating that distinctive, otherworldly sound. The guitar on Purple Haze sounded like nothing anyone had heard before. It sounded alien. It sounded like a purple sun breaking down reality. The song was released as a single in March 1967. Almost immediately, controversy erupted. DJs and music journalists assumed Purple Haze was about LSD. The purple color, the references to being confused and disoriented, the line about kissing the sky, it all seemed to add up to an acid trip. Some radio stations banned it outright. Others played it but with warnings. Parents' groups protested. Conservative politicians used it as evidence that rock music was corrupting young people. Jimi was baffled by the reaction. In interviews, he tried to explain that the song wasn't about drugs. "It's about a dream I had," he told one journalist, "a dream where I was walking under the sea and I couldn't tell if I was drowning or flying. Everything was purple." Another time he mentioned the science fiction story. "I was reading this book about a planet where the sun turns purple and people go crazy. That's what the song is about. It's not about drugs." But nobody believed him. Or if they believed him, they didn't care. The drug interpretation was more interesting, more scandalous, more useful for whatever point people were trying to make about youth culture and rebellion.
The BBC banned Purple Haze in several regions. American radio stations that did play it often introduced it with disclaimers. The song became a symbol of the psychedelic movement, whether Jimi wanted it to be or not. This frustrated Jimi deeply. He'd written a song inspired by science fiction and his own feelings of disorientation from fame, and the world had decided it was about getting high. The misinterpretation became so widespread that trying to correct it felt futile. "People hear what they want to hear," Jimi said in a 1968 interview. "I can tell them it's about a Philip K. Dick story, and they'll nod and then ask me what kind of acid I was on when I wrote it. After a while, you just give up trying to explain." The irony was that Jimi did use drugs. He smoked marijuana regularly. He'd tried LSD. So when people asked if Purple Haze was influenced by drugs, he couldn't say absolutely not. He could only say that's not what the song is about, which wasn't convincing to people who'd already made up their minds. What's even more ironic is that Philip K. Dick, the author of The Night of Light, didn't find out about Jimi's song until years later. When someone finally told him that Jimi Hendrix had written a rock anthem inspired by his story, Dick was amused. "I'm glad somebody got something useful out of that story," Dick said. "I always thought The Night of Light was one of my weirder ones. It makes sense that it would inspire a weird song."
The BBC banned Purple Haze in several regions. American radio stations that did play it often introduced it with disclaimers. The song became a symbol of the psychedelic movement, whether Jimi wanted it to be or not. This frustrated Jimi deeply. He'd written a song inspired by science fiction and his own feelings of disorientation from fame, and the world had decided it was about getting high. The misinterpretation became so widespread that trying to correct it felt futile. "People hear what they want to hear," Jimi said in a 1968 interview. "I can tell them it's about a Philip K. Dick story, and they'll nod and then ask me what kind of acid I was on when I wrote it. After a while, you just give up trying to explain." The irony was that Jimi did use drugs. He smoked marijuana regularly. He tried LSD. So when people asked if Purple Haze was influenced by drugs, he couldn't say absolutely not. He could only say, that's not what the song is about, which wasn't convincing to people who'd already made up their minds. What's even more ironic is that Philip K. Dick, the author of The Night of Light, didn't find out about Jimi's song until years later. When someone finally told him that Jimi Hendrix had written a rock anthem inspired by his story, Dick was amused. "I'm glad somebody got something useful out of that story," Dick said. "I always thought The Night of Light was one of my weirder ones. It makes sense that it would inspire a weird song." Dick never met Jimi. Jimi died before they could connect. But in later interviews, Dick expressed admiration for how Purple Haze captured the feeling of his story. "The song feels like reality breaking down. That's exactly what I was writing about."
The misinterpretation of Purple Haze had real consequences for Jimi. It became harder for him to be taken seriously as an artist when people thought his most famous song was just about getting high. Music critics would dismiss his work as drug-addled rambling, rather than recognizing the literary and musical sophistication behind it. Jimi tried to push back against this in subtle ways. In concerts, he'd sometimes introduce Purple Haze by saying, "This is a song about confusion," or "This is about not knowing what's real anymore." He hoped people would hear those introductions and reconsider their assumptions. But in the noise and chaos of a rock concert, those quiet explanations were lost. The song took on a life of its own, far beyond Jimi's control. It became an anthem for the counterculture, played at protests and love-ins. People claimed it as a drug song, a protest song, a sexual liberation song. Every group interpreted it to mean what they wanted it to mean. By 1969, Jimi had mostly given up trying to correct people. When interviewers asked about Purple Haze, he'd give vague answers or joke around rather than explain the Philip K. Dick connection. It was easier than fighting a battle he couldn't win. But to close friends, Jimi would sometimes express frustration about how his most famous song was misunderstood. "I wrote about science fiction, and people hear drugs," he told one friend. "I wrote about reality breaking down, and people think I'm talking about acid." The song means what it means, but nobody wants to hear that. One person who did understand was Chas Chandler, Jimi's manager. Chandler had been in the van when Jimi wrote the song. He'd seen Jimi reading the Philip K. Dick story. He knew the truth.
Jimi was a reader, Chandler said in an interview after Jimi's death. People don't know that about him. He loved science fiction, especially the weird stuff. Philip K. Dick, Kurt Vonnegut, Ray Bradbury. That's what Jimi read on tour. Purple Haze came from a book, not a drug trip, but tried telling that to people who want to believe the myth. The myth was powerful because it fit into a larger narrative about the 1960s and psychedelic rock. Purple Haze became Exhibit A in discussions about drug culture and music. Textbooks about rock history listed it as a quintessential acid rock song. Music critics analyzed the lyrics as coded references to the LSD experience. All of this happened while Jimi was alive and actively saying it wasn't true, but the myth was stronger than the truth. After Jimi died in 1970, the drug interpretation became even more cemented. His death from a drug-related incident seemed to confirm that his whole life and career had been about drugs. Purple Haze, according to this logic, must have been about drugs too. It wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that music historians started seriously investigating the Philip K. Dick connection. They tracked down the interviews where Jimi mentioned the science fiction story. They found the book and Jimi's belongings after his death. They talked to people who'd been around when Jimi wrote the song. Slowly, a different narrative emerged. Purple Haze wasn't primarily a drug song. It was a science fiction song. It was about reality breaking down, about perception becoming unreliable, about confusion and disorientation. Yes, those themes could be connected to drug experiences, but that wasn't the starting point. The starting point was a Philip K. Dick story about a purple sun. Music critic Grail Marcus wrote about this in a 2005 essay. "We spent 40 years thinking Purple Haze was about LSD. It wasn't. It was about a planet called Dante's Joy, where the sun turns purple and drives people mad. The joke is that Jimi told us this repeatedly, and we didn't listen. We were so invested in our interpretation that we ignored what the artist actually said." This revelation didn't change how most people heard the song. Purple Haze remained associated with psychedelia and drug culture. But for serious Jimi Hendrix scholars and fans, understanding the real origin of Purple Haze added depth to the song. If you listen to Purple Haze knowing it's about reality breaking down under a purple sun, the lyrics make more sense. Purple haze all in my brain. Lately things, they don't seem the same. That's someone experiencing the night of light from Dick's story. Acting funny, but I don't know why. That's reality becoming unreliable. "Excuse me while I kiss the sky," that's looking up at the purple sun with awe and confusion. The guitar solo makes more sense too. That weird alien sound Jimi created with the Octavia pedal? That's not just psychedelic for its own sake. It's meant to sound like reality warping, like the fabric of the universe coming apart. It's meant to sound purple. Even the way Jimi sang the song, slurred, slightly disoriented, questioning, fits with the Philip K. Dick interpretation. He's not singing about being high. He's singing about being unable to trust his own perceptions, about reality itself becoming questionable. Understanding the real origin of Purple Haze also illuminates something important about Jimi as an artist. He wasn't just a guitar virtuoso. He was a reader, a thinker, someone engaged with literature and ideas. He drew inspiration from science fiction, from dreams, from his inner life, not just from drugs and partying. This is the Jimi that often gets lost in the mythology. The careful craftsman who wrote songs with specific inspirations. The intellectual who read Philip K. Dick and thought deeply about perception and reality. The artist who got frustrated when people misunderstood his work.
Today, when people discuss Purple Haze, there's an asterisk. Yes, it became associated with drug culture. Yes, it functioned as a psychedelic anthem, but that wasn't what Jimi intended. What he intended was to capture the feeling of reading the night of light, that sense of reality becoming fluid, of the boundary between imagination and the real world dissolving. In a strange way, the misinterpretation of Purple Haze mirrors the theme of the song itself. A song about not knowing what's real became surrounded by a myth that wasn't real. A song about confusion created confusion about its own meaning. It's almost poetic. Jimi might have appreciated that irony, even if it frustrated him. He understood better than most that once you release art into the world, it takes on meanings you never intended. The purple haze in people's brains wasn't from LSD. It was from their own assumptions and desires, projected onto a song. The truth is that Purple Haze is about whatever you hear in it. Jimi wrote it about a science fiction story, but if someone hears drug culture or sexual liberation or political rebellion, that's real too. Art doesn't belong to the artist once it's released. It belongs to everyone. But it's worth knowing what Jimi actually intended. It's worth remembering that he read Philip K. Dick in the back of a tour van and wrote a song about a planet where the sun turns purple. It's worth acknowledging that he tried to tell us this, and we didn't listen. 50 years later, we're finally listening. Better late than never. If this story of misunderstood art and science fiction inspiration moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who loves Jimi Hendrix, or Philip K. Dick, or both. Have you ever created something that people completely misunderstood? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more untold stories from music's greatest legends. This is the final story in our Jimi Hendrix series. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and music of a legend. Purple Haze, all in our brains, indeed.